Everyone, I'm Martin from JetBrains and welcome to today's webinar. With us we have the ever amazing Paul Everett, who will guide us through React and TypeScript and TDD in Rider. Now, we thought it would be a cool idea to host this Rider webinar with Paul based on a tutorial that he created for PyCharm. And the URL that you see on the title slide here is the URL to that tutorial, and you can follow along if you want, or if you want to try afterwards, you can use that one as well. Now, as you may or may not know, Rider, PyCharm, and many of our other IDEs all share the engine from WebStorm when it comes to web development. So regardless of the fact that that tutorial is written on the PyCharm website, it will probably work in WebStorm and Rider and so on as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Martin, for inviting me, and thank you, Rider Crowd, for allowing a Python refugee to come over and talk about, of all things, JavaScript and TypeScript. And Martin has also promised that if my redneck, ugly American accent gets too bad, he will message me in Slack and say, please speak in the Queen's English. As Martin mentioned, this is all available at a URL that is currently being shown. It's also in the chat window for GoToWebinar. And we'll be covering some amount of this. To get to the end would be 3 hours. Martin said, please keep it under 3 hours. Does that mean like 2.5 hours is okay?
I think more likely 1 hour. And
1 hour, okay, so we'll stick with 1 hour. And if we'll try and go through this at a reasonable speed, but all this material is available with a narrated video and code snippets in each one of these pages. So I'll go ahead and start. The start for this uses something called Create React App. In the world of modern front-end development, there's a lot to think about. Let's just put it that way. I'm trying to put it a little more diplomatically. There's a lot to think about, and it changes very, 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 very fast. And so the React crowd came up with a scaffolding tool called Create React App, which gives you a great out-of-the-box experience with everything wired up, and then they promise to keep control of the madness, making sure that the thousands of NPM packages and versions all work well together. And so this app presumes that you have run, or this webinar presumes that you have run this command, and that's the starting point that I will use for this. So over to Rider, and I've got this project open in Rider. This is the output of Create React App. If you do any modern front-end development, it will feel familiar to you. There's a package.json file, and it is the entry point to the universe, and then source code under here and some other directories and files that we will talk about in a moment. This has generated a TypeScript file, and we can go ahead and be productive by, for example, going to the terminal and running npm run script start. And when I fire this up, it will launch the, we'll call it the Webpack dev server is what it launches. And this is a tool that will compile your TypeScript React app, give you a server running at a port, and the amazing thing it will do is as you edit your files, yeah, that's what, I'm so OCD. Okay, as you edit your files and, for example, put a exclamation here and save, when I go back, it has recompiled the universe and told the browser to reload itself. So if I had a bigger screen to show in the webinar, I would have these side by side, Rider on one side, my browser on the other, and I don't even have to go focus in the browser to see the results of my work. Now, that's all great. Actually, that is pretty cool. The world of front-end development has a developer experience, which is pretty good. But I'm running in this terminal down here. We are in IDE. Can't we do better than running something in a terminal? I'm glad you asked, because in fact we can. There are ways to run these NPM scripts. Let me go back to it. These NPM scripts, such as start, from the IDE in a pretty window instead. So I could go to NPM and bring up the tool window I could also do it from down here. I should mention that I've set my IDE up. I've set Rider up in the dark theme. I've turned off tabs. I've turned off most of the tool windows, and I've got a slimmed down developer experience. So I've done the equivalent of coming to the tool window for NPM, and I can start each one of these NPM scripts in a nice little window. But that's not actually how I do it. I open the package.json file and go to the script I want and click the play button and do run start. What we get is a tool window rather than the console. And so we get a little bit nicer output, a little bit nicer UI, and a pretty familiar interface if you're used to our IDEs. So that's all working. I'm running it in the IDE now. And as I make changes, it recompiles and reloads the web browser. Let's take a look at what Create React App, the scaffolding tool, does when it downloads the entire quantity of npm.js. It generates a package.json file with a suspiciously thin dependencies list. Why do I say suspiciously thin? Because it's moved a lot of the work to subpackages. What that means is they can do the changes, and all you have to do is update this package, and then the universe, which they manage the version pinning on, will be updated in your Create React App project. And so, for example, under dev dependencies, these are, let's see, all 5 of these I added, and we'll show in part 3 about testing to get enzyme testing. And then they also generate these scripts that you can run and then put a little bit more in the package.json file. What else can we do? Well, we're running a development server, which is great for development. You type, you save, it recompiles and reloads hands-free, but it's a development build. It's all in memory. It's not minified. It's not meant for public consumption. When it's time to deploy, I run the build script instead of the start script. And the build script will spin up your CPU fan, that's for sure. And it will take the universe of your app and all the dependencies and build a minified, small public version of your React app. And you can take this build directory, the contents of the build directory, it's got an index.html, it's got some static assets. This all came from the public directory. And all of your code, and you can ship it over to a static web server, and you're self-contained. You do not need Node.js. You don't need anything. It's all minified and tree shaked and all of that crazy goodness. I'll go ahead and delete this directory for now so that we don't wind up coming back to it. I don't want the indexer to hit it. Okay, so that's the production build from React and Create React App, and I ran it from the little gutter icon in the package.json file. It built it. And now I want to take a look at testing. So for example, Create React App out of the box uses Jest, a test runner from Facebook. Jest is quite interesting because it doesn't test in a browser. It tests in a fake browser called JSDOM, which means it's quite lightweight. It's a browser implemented in JavaScript. This is a test, and I can run it. I could run it if I wanted to, the same thing that I did before, and say test. I could also, though, go to the package.json and run test. And again, in a tool window in the bottom, we bring up the test output. I'll go back to my test. I will put something in that breaks. Save, and a little bit later, it tells me that one of my tests failed. Now, this is ugly output. We will see 2 steps from now how to use the native test runner, the native tool window for Jest. And I can put this back, save it, and my test run, and say that they now pass. All right, I will stop at this point since we have a little bit of the setup going, and I will take any questions, and Martin will also point out how Rider does some of this.
Yeah, so first of all, no questions so far, so that means that you're probably doing a very good job. We'll quickly switch over to my screen as well, because obviously what you are seeing in Paul's project there is a folder-based project with just the React stuff in there. But ideally, you also want to be able to work in your ASP.NET Core applications. The cool thing is that if you create a new React and ASP.NET Core project in Rider, what you will typically get is a nice solution with a project file. And in it, you will find everything that you would expect that will render your API, for example. So we have a weather forecast controller there. We have some pages with view imports. We have a program.cs, startup.cs, and so on. But also we have this client app folder, and this client app folder is essentially where you would put all of the stuff that your React single page application consists of. Now, obviously, if we would run from our package.json this start script and have our React server spin up and serve all of the components and templates that we are creating, that will work, obviously. But the downside of using that one is that our server application will not run in that case. What is really cool is if you use the .NET New templates to generate this React plus ASP.NET Core application, the really nice thing there is that in your startup, a couple of new middlewares will be registered. So for example, when we are running the development server, we are also registering the use React development server middleware there. And what will happen is if we run our application in development mode, the ASP.NET Core web server will start. And what it will do is recognize that we are in development mode and under the hood, run the NPM script called start. So under the hood, what will happen is that ASP.NET will run this one and will proxy everything that React itself generates for us, but integrate that into our ASP.NET Core application so that we can run our single page application as well as the server side in one go without having to do a lot of interactive magic and making sure that that thing runs. You may also ask what will happen if we want to build this thing and publish this thing. Well, if you publish the application, like Paul mentioned, you will have to build the application and make sure that you have all the static artifacts that are being generated. What is cool is that in your project file, you will see that the default ASP.NET Core plus React templates will add a build target that will, on publish, run npm install to make sure that all of your dependencies are up to date, and also will run npm run build to make sure that that static content is being generated inside of that public folder here in the client app. And then it will include all of those static files generated into the project output so that you can compile and publish your entire ASP.NET Core and React application in one go. So that's a little bit of the ASP.NET Core magic that's going on in there.
It's interesting because Webpack Dev Server has a proxy mode so that it is the server, and then something like .NET would be behind it. And so essentially you've reversed the polarity on that.
Yeah, exactly. So .NET inverses that and makes sure that .NET is the front end and it's proxying whatever React has going on in the back end.
That's pretty cool because I found that proxy mode in Webpack Dev Server to be a little bit fiddly.
Well, the real benefit here is since you will be deploying this application anyway, your actual application will be an ASP.NET Core application as well that is running on the server. So it's kind of nice to have that as the entry points to the entire application, even during development.
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to test what you're going to deploy with, or develop with what you're going to deploy with.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, switch it back over to me. And one point I want to add, I should have added at the beginning, is that this tutorial is based on the first version of Create React App that supported TypeScript. They then did an update which dramatically changed the generated project away from classes to functional components, for example, ripped out TSLint and replaced it with ESLint. When that all stabilizes a little bit, I will redo my tutorial. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about styling and linting right now. I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. This is the next step in the tutorial. project cleanup, and we're going to do a little bit that's talked about here. So fiddling with spaces, fiddling with semicolons, fiddling with imports, all these things are janitorial work. When you have to do janitorial work, it takes you out of the flow, but our IDEs like to keep you in the flow, so we do the janitorial work for you. Reformat code is something that I do 10,000 times a day. Even when I haven't typed anything, I do reformat code just to convince my brain that I'm still working. And so what it did, I'll undo, it applied the style settings that were defined in this project. And this project said 4 spaces for tabs and things like that. And now I'm going to go back over to my application code and do the same thing. And when I do, I see I get all the spacing, all that kind of stuff. Everything's pretty cool. And what I want to do is remove this div and put in something that's a lot smaller, so that as I get into writing my application and doing some testing, I don't have as much to look at, and we'll gradually add a little bit more along the way. I should also point out that Create React App doesn't generate support for something called Prettier, which is a code styling tool for JavaScript, which everyone has adopted, but it's pretty easy to add, and our IDEs support it very, very well to use settings from Prettier. All right, so now I've got a little bit of a simpler starting point. Now I want to do a little bit more cleanup. We see that because my markup changed and I'm no longer using this image, I get a warning saying that I have an unused import. Well, look at where my cursor is. I'm in the middle of my actual work. Do I want to stop what I'm doing? Go to the top of the file, delete that line just to clean it up. The second thing I do 10,000 times a day, optimize imports. This action will go and remove unused imports. It will combine multiple imports from the same target. It will sort them according to your settings for how you want your imports sorted. Also want to do a little bit more cleanup. I'm not using this line anymore. So let's say I go over here to delete the file, and I do safe delete. And I'll delete this line. This is something that Martin and I have covered. Safe delete should warn that we are deleting something that is still in use. So I can also delete, let's see, the file for logo.svg. So I've cleaned up a little bit. And another thing that the IDE will warn you about when doing React projects, often you will forget to do the import. And it will tell you, this is JSX. You can't do JSX without importing React. Let the IDE do it for you, Alt-Enter, add import statement, and it generates the TypeScript style ES6 import that React uses. Always let the IDE be the janitor for you. Let's say I'm doing some refactoring. App, this is the name that I get out of the box. I want to call it my app. Well, you know, I'll have to type my app here, and then I'll have to go down here and type it there. And then, well, I don't even know where it's used in this project. What other places am I going to have to go? Well, I'll go do find usages. And yep, it's in the test. It's in the index.tsx entry point. God, where else might it be? Wouldn't it be nice if the IDE could refactor, rename that symbol to my app, change it at the bottom of the file, go over and change it in the test. Oop. Did I do it? Let's see, index.tsx. I think, oh yeah, I didn't complete that correctly. All right, sorry, I hit the wrong key for finishing. Rename my app, enter. And then
I think you missed the enter there somehow.
All right, and I'm going to hit enter.
All right, do a tab.
Ah, okay, yes, sorry. I needed to do one more enter. Apologies, because it was offering me one other piece of help along the way for the code completion. And this is pretty cool about what the IDE is doing for us. What Ryder is saying is the world of React has a convention called single responsibility principle. Other programming languages do as well. And what it means is one file, one component, one responsibility. And the style is that the name of the class should be the name of the file. And so it's saying, hey, do you want to do the rename? Why, yes, I do want you to do that. So it will do that. It will fix up my VCS entry for that file so that it's now myapp.tsx. And in my test code, that import is fixed. And in my entry point, that import is fixed. So great. Thank you very much, IDE, for being my janitor for me. But let's say I then think, oh my God, that's so stupid. Now I'm going to have my in front of everything in my project. Could you possibly put it back for me? Oh no, I've got to go fix VCS, go find all the places, blah, 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 blah. Undo, the undo transaction will cover not just the renaming of the symbol, not just the renaming of the usages, not just the renaming of the file, but the VCS as well. So we've put it back exactly the way that we wanted to before proceeding. So I will stop at that point. Yes, Chris, should I see that question? Thank you. I should have gotten it the first time. Martin, do we have anything that we should cover that you spotted?
Well, maybe that's an interesting one for everyone. So I don't know if everyone is watching the questions pane there for questions that arise. But we had a question from Christian asking whether when we rename a class there, does it only work in TypeScript or does it also work in plain JavaScript?
It also works in JavaScript, which is one of the great things. I got to give a shout out to the WebStorm team. They are suffering the pain of the world of JavaScript so you don't have to. Not only TypeScript, but we index with the same indexing machinery that you use in Writer for all of your .NET code. We index JavaScript symbols as well. Guess what? We index CSS symbols. So if you have a div with a class of myapp and you rename it, it will find the CSS and you can find usages to go find the places that are using that symbol. Martin, anything to add to that?
No, it will work cross languages and yeah, in JavaScript, in TypeScript, in CSS, even in HTML and so on.
Yep. Okay, we're going to go on to the next step, which is getting into testing. This is the fun part for me. I will note that while I'm over here, I will note that I did this step prior to starting the webinar because it takes a little while, and I also did this step as well. But let's begin. Testing. So I want to show learning and developing React and TypeScript, not by using the browser, but by using tests so that you can stay in the flow, stay in the IDE, and let it do the help for you. Let's have a better testing experience. I'm going to make a run configuration based on jest. I'm going to leave it as all test. This empty field is where the WebStorm team has done great things for you. They know out of the box how to wire up all the craziness of jest. The only thing I'm going to do is add a flag that says whenever anything changes, rerun the tests. -- watch says when anything, only rerun the test that changed. Now, when I run my tests, I get a nice tool window down here. I will close the test runner here. I can even close the transpiling tool because I'm not going to be going to a browser anymore. So I got my tests up here. I can go back. I can change this to be 2, save, and it fails in a much nicer, friendlier way. So for example, it tells me with a little squiggly exactly where my test failed. It puts a gutter decoration over here of red to tell me which tests fail. But let's say I'm in another file. I don't even have the test open. Now, with the test output down here, I can double click on this line. It will open the file with the test and put you on the line you expect to be on, just as you expect with all the test code you write for .NET. Martin, let me stop at that point. You and I had a little bit of discussion about this tool window, and maybe you can talk about the testing experience in .NET.
Yeah, so basically Paul and I had a chat yesterday on how we would use the tool window and how we would write our tests and so on. And usually when I write tests in C# codes, I work with roughly the same editor layout as Paul has right now, where I have my Solution Explorer open, maybe some other tool windows. My code is open, maybe my test is open, and I have my test tool window open as well. Now, one thing that I personally like a lot is to enable continuous testing, which works for JavaScript, but also works for .NET if you have .cover installed. And what that allows us to do is basically hide the tool window unless a test fails. And that really gets the tool window out of the way while I write my test, while I write the code implementing the tests, and only shows up whenever I'm doing something wrong. And yeah, completely disappears again whenever I'm doing something right.
Okay, so I just made it fail, and then when this gets out of the way, all right. So I'm going to bring back the test window, the run window, and this next part's a little bit theoretical. Test-driven development. It's the way you're supposed to work, but it can feel a little bit like eat your vegetables. I approach test-driven development completely differently. I do it not because I should get a scout badge for being a good boy. I do it because it's a better, more productive way to work. And when I want to get into TDD mode, what I do to convince my brain that I'm in TDD mode is I close this panel. I'm not using tabs, so instead I'm going to split vertically. And then on the left, I have my code that I'm writing the test for. On the right, I have the test that's testing that code. And then at the bottom, I have the test output, the test runner. And this immediately tells my brain to start thinking like you're in TDD. So let me go fix this test. And I'm going to write a test that confirms that we have an H1 that does the right thing. So this test, again, it's in the tutorial page that is here. So I'm going to say it renders the heading, and this is going to be an arrow function. And I'm going to get, this is a little bit of jest and enzyme foo. I'm going to get a shallow renderer. This comes from enzyme. And what the shallow renderer does is it doesn't mount child components. It only mounts one component. So it's very fast, and it's the preferred thing to do when you're using enzyme. I'm going to be switching away from enzyme in my redo of this over to the React testing library. So when I hit enter, it generates the import for me. I didn't have to do the import. Thank you very much, IDE, for doing my work for me. And now I need to mount something. And I do reformat code, and it adds the semicolon for me. And then the next line I say expect wrapper.find of an H1, is that right? Yep, H1, and then get the text from that. And to be hello React. Now when I save, test runs, it's green, means it's good. If I came over here and broke the contract, the test would fail. And this is something pretty cool. They in newer versions from WebStorm, they will put a little console highlighting to show you the place in the diff that it failed. All right, so I'm going to put that back. And so we're in good shape. We wrote a test to confirm part of this. Let's do actual TDD. We're going to add a paragraph in here, but before we add that quote unquote feature, I'm going to write a failing test. So what I'm going to do is come over here. I'm going to clone this, renders the paragraph. Oop. I'm going to get the P. I'm going to say nice TDD. I like that. Now when I save, this fails, which is good. It's supposed to fail. I wrote a failing test before I wrote the implementation. Tells me exactly how it fails. This red squiggly says this failed because it couldn't find a P. There were 0 P's to be found. So I'll come back over and I'll implement this feature. I'll save. And now my 3 tests pass because I did TDD mode, code on the left, test on the right, test runner at the bottom. All right, so that's the end of this section. Martin, got any comments or questions?
I do have one question, but it's not really related to TDD so far. So let's maybe park it for a while and ask that at the end of the webinar.
Okay, great. And
Unless
please, anybody, if you have any questions, or
Rails.
even if you have a better way of doing things, share it with us and we'll pass it along to everybody else.
Yeah, unless you like being derailed, then I can ask it now.
I was never railed.
All right, then I guess I can derail you. Would you have any tips around reusing code between multiple projects? Like how would you tackle that and maybe including tests?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting point. So the world of, this is really a Node.js question and packaging in Node.js and things like that. You can use something called npm link, which lets you have code in another place that is included into your current workspace. You could make a separate package, separate npm package for that and make releases of it and then import that, put it in your package.json as a dependency and import it into your project. There is a concept in Yarn, which is an alternative to npm called workspaces. Yarn 2 should be out any day now, and it improves workspaces. And that is something that can simulate to some degree sharing. You can develop separate independent packages within one writer project. Am I in the ballpark of an answer?
I think it's in the ballpark of an answer. Yeah, I'll provide a couple of links with some additional resources, and I guess you can get back on the rails.
All right, great, thanks. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about debugging, but first I'm going to, let me go to the section over here. First, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to, I'm going to remove this test since we're not actually using it. And let's see, I'm going to add a feature and then debug it. And the feature is we would like this heading to be parameterizable. I don't think I got that right. Able to be parametered. Maybe that's closer. And what I want is a function that I can run and test independently and then use in this component. So what I'm going to do is export a arrow function called label. And it's going to return hello world. Format a little bit, add a space. Note that I'm not doing TDD. I should have written a test first, but it's part of the flow of this that we're going to fix by remembering that we should have done TDD. So this method is good. It's pretty simple, does what we need. And now we're going to use it in this H1 by doing label. Oop. When I save, oh, I should have said React. When I save, the tests pass because I didn't change kind of the public interface. I just changed the implementation of it a little bit. Now, this needs a test, and this is what I should have done. I should have written a test and then written the function and then used it in my component. So let's write a test. It generates a label. Arrow function. And here's where it gets a little more interesting. Tab so that it generates that import for me. I didn't have to do that. And I expect the L to be hello React. And when I run this, the test pass, but what's cool is I extracted functionality out of the React universe, out of the DOM universe, out of the JS DOM universe. It's just TypeScript, and it can be tested without having to mock up a fake browser, just doing it the way that you would expect normal programming to be. I didn't have to make a fake DOM and mount a component and render it and look at the HTML output using some little programming language. So that's cool. But let's say that I have a feature that I want to add to this, and I want the feature to capitalize the name that we're saying hello to. What I'll do is I'll change this to make the test fail. Oop. And the first thing I'm going to do is parameterize this with a name that needs to be passed in. This string is going to become what's called a template string. It's something from ES6, and it's basically the way everyone is doing even strings that don't need dynamicism, they're doing it. And what I'll need to do is change these ticks to backticks. Well, that's a programming chore that kind of sucks. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just do Alt-Enter and replace with template string? Thank you, IDE. That was very nice of you. And now I can put in my parameter. And this is yelling at me because I'm not passing in a parameter. This is yelling at me because I'm not passing in a parameter. This is yelling at me, but why is it yelling at me? It's yelling at me because this is TypeScript, and I'm supposed to put a type on this value, which is very familiar to the audience that I'm currently talking to. Typing is normal. So what I need is a colon string on this. The IDE can help me on this by inferring the types from the usage. And there you go. It knows that it's supposed to get a string. Now when I save, I fail because I haven't done the capitalization yet. This needs to be to uppercase. Now when I save, I have fulfilled the test passed, I implemented my feature correctly. Now, on to the topic of this step, debugging. And before I get into it, I've talked a little bit about TDD mode as a philosophy. There's another philosophy, probably familiar to the writer audience, but new to the Python world and JavaScript world, fail faster. What is the worst time to fail? Well, it's the latest time when the customer reports the error to you. What's a better time to fail? During a test. What's an even better time to fail? When the IDE tells you with a red squiggly, you've broken the contract. And this is why I'm a big fan of the convergence for web development, the convergence of TypeScript and testing. I feel like even if I'm the only one on the project, I'm a consumer of my code. The test is a consumer of my code. I put type information so I can fail faster in the test, and I get a red squiggly, and it tells me exactly what I did wrong because I have TypeScript in the typing information. But let's just say I'm, for the sake of argument, let's just say I'm a moron. And I'm staring at this. I'm tired. I've been looking at it all day. Oh my God, what is the problem? I'm giving you 42. Give it back. I need not just testing, I need the debugger. What most people will do is start sprinkling console.log statements here. Console.log will not help you. You are in jest. It captures the output. Instead, you can come over to your friendly IDE and say, debug this test. Debug just this one test. And it will run just under the Node.js debugger. It will spin up the universe. Oh, I need to put a breakpoint. It will spin up the universe, and it will stop on that line that I've got the breakpoint on. Where am I getting that? Oh, am I doing run? Maybe I did run. Okay, good. I think I did the second time, I think I did run instead of debug. It will stop on this line, and I can do all the things that you know and love about the writer debugger. I can smart step into that line. I can get to this line. I can stare at it menacingly, hoping it capitulates. When it
You
doesn't
are not Chuck
capitulate,
Norris.
what's that?
You are not Chuck Norris who can just stare at code and make it work automatically.
Not yet, but I know you are, so I need some pro tips from you. And I can select that code, I can right click and say evaluate expression, and I can then poke around. I can evaluate that expression. Well, you're not telling me anything I didn't already know. My gosh, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Name, what am I doing wrong? Maybe I should do type of. Oh, that's what I'm doing wrong. So the combination of debugging and testing let me interactively poke around at a point in the execution of the test until I found what the problem was. And now I run it, I put it back the way it was, stop the debugger, run my test, clear the breakpoint, run my tests. And my tests all pass. So that was a tutorial step that talked about using the debugger instead of console log when you are stuck during testing. I will stop there. Martin, you got anything?
No questions from the audience, but I do have a question.
Sure.
So before you had the failing test where you were also passing in 42. Now imagine I would write that label function as something that takes a string as well as an integer. What would be the test cases that you would write for that? Would you write
Like that?
them only for string, only for number, for both? What would be your test matrix, so to speak?
This gets pretty interesting from a TypeScript perspective, and then there's the implementation. What you would need to do is detect whether it was a string or a number and uppercase it or do something separate for number. And then the return value would be something different based on what you passed in, which gets into some of the capabilities that TypeScript has added over the years. Unsurprising, since TypeScript came from the C# guy. And I would write, let's see, I would write tests for both cases, but maybe I would also try to do a case that made it fail as well as succeed. I have a feeling you've got a good suggestion on this.
Well, I was wondering if there's something like code coverage in there as well that you could use
Yes,
to
there is
check
code
whether
coverage.
you tested all of the different cases that you have in your label function in that case.
Yep. Yes, there is code coverage, but I don't have the package installed that would turn it on. Oh, no, I do. Okay, yes, I could run this test or all tests with coverage, and it would bring up what the writer crowd is already expecting, which is the coverage panel with the tabular thing and gutter decorations showing code that doesn't have tests.
Cool, thanks.
All right. Okay, we're going to go on to the next one, and I probably won't spend too much time on this. Debugging in an actual browser. We just debugged our test. We ran our test and debugged our test in Node.js, but sometimes you need an actual browser because you're using an API that's only available there. How would we do it? I will stop this test runner. I'm going to bring back the dev pack, the Webpack dev server build. Okay, there it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this URL, and I'm going to go make a new run configuration. But this run configuration is going to be of type JavaScript debug. And I'll say JS tests. And I'm going to put in the URL to go get the input from, so to speak. I'm going to make sure it points at Chrome. And then I'm going to say apply OK. And I'm going to put the breakpoint in here. And this time I'm going to run under the debugger that run configuration. And it's going to fire up a private copy of Chrome, a different instance of the browser where the profile is created and deleted on every test run. And we talk to Chrome using the Chrome Developer Tools protocol to remote control the JavaScript engine in Chrome from within Writer. And you set a breakpoint, and it goes and sets a breakpoint over in the JavaScript engine inside Writer. So if I do reload now, it will stop on the line that I had the breakpoint. If I have event handlers, when I click, it will stop on the breakpoint of the event handler. From the perspective of developer experience, you think you're in the IDE, but the execution is actually in the browser. All the tools that you would expect, setting conditional breakpoints, stepping through code, having JavaScript exceptions that pop up from your managed breakpoints. All of these things that you expect from our debugging engine apply even though it's executing externally. Very, very productive way to work. All right, so I'm going to stop that one, come back over here, clear this breakpoint. And Martin, I have...
Can I quickly interrupt you there? Maybe another tip for people who are building full stack applications, so both React as well as the .NET server sites. If you go into the run configurations.
Okay, I'll go into the run configurations.
Yeah. If you have, right now, obviously you don't have a .NET solution open, but imagine you have your server side and your client side, and you want to have your server run while you are debugging your test like you have been showing here. What you can do is create a compound run configuration. And in that compound run configuration, configure that you want to start your server and add your JavaScript debug configuration there as well. So basically you're telling Writer to launch 2 run configurations at that point in time. And what's really cool is that not only you get debugging from the test that you just showed as well, but in case you have a breakpoint in your server-side code, you also hit those breakpoints at the same time. And it looks and feels a little bit like magic, but it's super useful to debug both the server side as well as the front ends.
We did not have that in PyCharm. That is pretty cool. All right. Okay, let's see if we can make a little bit of headway through this next tutorial step before we run out of time. And this one gets a little bit more into learning React, TypeScript, etc. So in this one, we want to go back to just a couple of simple tests. We're going to get rid of the one I did here because we're going to modularize things a little bit. And in our component, I want this to just go back to be hello React, and this to go away. When I save, reformat, because I do that 1,000 times. When I save, hopefully my test, I'll close you, go back to getting the test runner. Need to get optimize imports, get rid of that. And you need to go back to being hello React. So we're back in a good starting point. And what I want to do is modularize this a little bit so that the parameterization of this works with click handlers and arrow functions. So I'm going to go back to putting in what I'll start with is inside here, I'm going to say label equals hello React. And it's going to be a little bit mad because it's not being used. Well, let's see, I want to put this, since this is an arrow function, so I'm going to put this in, actually, I'm going to switch this from an arrow function to a class so I can stick with the tutorial. And so this is going to extend component. And let's see, I will take this out. And I'll need a render. All right. All right, I'm going to just go over here since I'm leaving a symbol out. Oh, I don't have my import. All right. Okay, good. So I've got this set up in a good way, and I want to add a label that I'm going to test. And then I want to use this in the heading. All right. And this will get the value off the instance, which is currently being done as kind of a class variable. We want to click handler. And so I'm going to probably get to the point of just showing the minimum of this before running out of time. I want to click handler on the H1 that will pop up an alert. So my first attempt at this is going to be on click, and notice the capitalization of this. This is React JSX, which needs a different naming scheme for these things. And I'm going to say alert hello world inside the H1. Now it's going to get mad, and it's going to get mad because TypeScript is saying the value that's being assigned to this void is not assignable here. We need a handler, and that's because this is being immediately executed. What we need it to be executed only when the click happens. So my first attempt to fix this will be to put in an arrow function. This satisfies it, it returns a void. This will not be executed until we actually execute this. So TypeScript is helping on this, that's pretty good. We've got an arrow function. I will save this, and I'll actually run this in the browser to show that it's working. I click on this, and I get my alert. So that's pretty good, but it's not really as testable as you'd like it to be. And more importantly, the React crowd doesn't like click handlers that are anonymous functions because they execute every time render happens, and that's inefficient. So what they want you to do is move this somewhere else, such as a handle click method. And I will switch over to showing this in the write-up instead of typing it since we're running low on time. We're going to move it to a method called handle click, and then the on click handler will reference it. And it will say alert, and then it'll get executed. But then when we go and look at it in the browser, we get this enormous long traceback saying that label's undefined. Well, why is label undefined? Because this, when we get inside here, it's not bound to the scope of the class instance. It's bound to the event. The event is this, and this doesn't have a label on it. So the first attempt to fix it, we could do a change here to have an arrow function. Arrow functions actually fix the scope so that this will then become the scope of the class instance. But then we're back to the problem we were trying to get rid of, which is arrow functions in a render get re-executed constantly, and that's not really what we want. Instead, what we can do is switch to saying this.handle click and have this as an property. This handle click, instead of being a method on the class, it's a property that happens to use an arrow function for its implementation. Martin, I will stop there and instead I'll just talk a little bit about what is in the rest of the tutorial. We show functional components versus class components. We show sharing props into React using interfaces in TypeScript. So you get red squigglies when you break the contract on a component. We model state with interfaces. And then a very interesting one, we use the enzyme event handlers to simulate events such as a click. So you go grab a component, you pretend to click on it, and then see if it reacted the way that you want it to. All right, I will stop there and take any questions or have any feedback from you, Martin.
No questions so far. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the question pane. Otherwise, we can wrap up a minute early, I guess.
All right.
I do see a question there. I didn't catch very well, Martin, what you meant with the .NET application. So can you switch back to your IDE, Paul? Yeah. So basically, what we have in the IDE is in the case of Paul's project there, we have a folder-based project. So if you open up the Solution Explorer or Project Explorer, you will see that we've just opened a folder. If you're building a .NET Web application, what you will typically do is create, of course, an ASP.NET application that contains the startup class, that contains the program class, and so on. But still, we want to be able to serve up our React application as well. What you can do is on every single time that you want to debug and check a change that you made to a template or whatever, is to run the build commands and make sure that all the static content is generated and can be served up from within the ASP.NET application. But obviously during development, that's not something that you will want. So instead, what the middleware is doing that is registered with the default ASP.NET plus React templates, what it does is run the npm start script in the background so that whenever you make a change, that thing is still running, and all that is happening in the browser is basically the browser making a request to our ASP.NET application and the ASP.NET application proxying that request towards the npm process that is running in the back, just like Paul is doing here. I do hope that helps. If not, I did write up a big blog post on how this thing works today. So if you look at the recording or look at the blog post where we post the recording of this webinar, I'll provide a big write-up on how that works in ASP.NET.
It's a great write-up, highly recommended.
All right, cool. With that, no further questions I see, so I guess we can switch back and wrap up here. Show my monitor too. Yeah, there we go. So if you want to learn more about Rider, feel free to go to our website, follow us on Twitter. We share tips and tricks there as well as news about JetBrains Rider as well. The recording of this webinar will be on JetBrains TV afterwards. I did mention the blog as well, so if you go to the blog, you will also find the recording there in the coming days. Something else that you also find on the blog is our next webinar with Rachel. And she will be talking about building an ASP.NET Core application from start to finish, I think in next week or the week thereafter, yes. So feel free to register for that one as well. I do want to thank you for joining the webinar, and I want to thank Paul for presenting here. If you did find this interesting and you want to try the TDD approach yourself and explore whatever is in there, the full tutorial is on the PyCharm website. And yeah, with that, thanks again for joining us today, and keep an eye on our YouTube channel as well as our blog for the recording of the webinar. And yeah, find previous recordings there as well if you want. Thank you for joining. See ya.